So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We need to adjust the volume a bit, I think. Great. My name is Bruce Karstedt, the head of the American Swedish Institute, and very delighted to have all of you gathered today to join in a community-wide observation and honoring of Raoul Wallenberg. As you know, 2012 represents the 100th anniversary of Raoul Wallenberg's birth. We know of Raoul Wallenberg for his heroic actions at the close of World War II. We know that he saved the lives of tens of thousands of people, together with brave and loyal colleagues, and that he sacrificed his life and his future for others in that mission of mercy and bravery. Today is a moment to pause, to reflect, to honor, and to consider what we might do, inspired by his example in today's bewildering and often violent world. We do this in separate parts of the afternoon's program. First, through the words of Ingemar Eliasson, whom I will introduce shortly. Following his talk, there will be a brief intermission during which you have a chance to gather, enjoy some hors d'oeuvres and refreshments, and then we'll regather in this hall at 4 o'clock for a performance first of music by Janet Horvath and her accompanist Heather McLaughlin, and following that we will conclude the afternoon with the personal reflections of three survivors, Charles Fodor, Fred Barron, and Dr. Robert Fish, moderated by Dr. Dan Wildeson from St. Cloud State University. I want to say that we're grateful for a gift of art, a lithograph by Dr. Robert Fish, which honors Raoul Wallenberg, displayed to my left, to your right, in this hall. And given the overwhelming response to today's program, we may not have anticipated ordering enough of the lapel pins, but I hope that each of you has received this gift today. It's a pin which draws upon, for its design inspiration, the Raoul Wallenberg Memorial near the United Nations building in New York City, a briefcase with the initials RW, representing the unfinished business of Raoul Wallenberg's mission. My colleagues and I at the American Swedish Institute are privileged to co-host this program today with our friends at the Jewish Community Relations Council, headed by my good friend and colleague Steve Hunnigs, its executive director. Steve also has words of welcome before I introduce our guest speaker. So Steve, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Bruce, dear friend. It's been many years since we embarked upon this effort at commemorating appropriately Raoul Wallenberg. It's been a series of remarkable events for our local Swedish community. The inauguration of the ASI campus in this gorgeous Nelson Cultural Center, the visit of the King and Queen of Sweden, and now just yesterday, a quarterback with the last name of Nelson from Mankato was absolutely spectacular in the first half yesterday for the Gophers, and loyal Gopher season football ticket holder that I am, I just saw this yet as another example of collaboration between Swedes and Jews yesterday. Remarkably, this very day in history, October 28, 1944, demonstrated yet another act of incredible bravery by Raoul Wallenberg. On this day, according to a physician, Dr. Stephen Lazarowitz, who witnessed this with his own eyes, the doctor was aboard one of the last trains of deportation of the Jews of Budapest. He was headed towards an unknown fate. A car comes by, a staff car, and out steps Wallenberg with an assistant. And just like it was a typical day in Budapest for Raoul Wallenberg, a portable desk that he had materialized. He sat it down between two rails, sat at that desk, some large tomes from the Swedish embassy, and proclaimed, "Anybody aboard this train who had the appropriate Swedish documentation, please step off the train." And there he sat in the full view of the SS, going through these individuals and saying, "You go here, and you go here, and you go here." Again, this was the face of Raoul Wallenberg, the face of humanity in the face of evil. I want to join Bruce in such great thanks for this opportunity. Working with many members of the ASI staff, Bruce and Karen and Chelsea and Peggy and Diane and many other wonderful people. I have two of my staff that are here today, Anthony Sussman and Susie Greenberg, and of course our participants, Mr. Eliasson, Ms. Eliasson, who is here with us, Dan Wilderson, Fred Barron, Charles Fodor, Dr. Fish, Janet Horvath, Heather McLaughlin, whose beautiful music you will hear. Just want to express myself. I wrote a couple letters to our participants on this day, and I wanted to say first to Mr. Eliasson, thank you. We are privileged to learn from you more about the life of Mr. Wallenberg, the legacy flowing from his heroic actions in Budapest, and your experiences in connection with chairing the Commission of Inquiry investigating his disappearance. This is an important day as we celebrate Mr. Wallenberg as an icon of both the Jewish and Swedish communities in Minnesota. And to you, Bruce, it's a great pleasure to partner with you and the American Swedish Institute in connection with the 100th anniversary of the birth of Raoul Wallenberg. I hope you'll take a minute during our event today to appreciate the 350 people in your beautiful Nelson Cultural Center learning about the life of Raoul Wallenberg and his legacy, and reflect upon all ASI has accomplished in the past year and will accomplish going forward. I appreciate that JCRC has been a beneficiary of this marvelous momentum as our two pieces of Wallenberg collaboration go forth. I look forward to building upon this foundation of personal and institutional friendship and share mutual goals for the benefit of our community. And Bruce, if you'll pay us the honor of introducing Mr. Eliasson, that would be terrific. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everyone. Ingemar Eliasson was born and spent his childhood and formative years in a part of Sweden where my ancestors came from, a province called Värmland in west-central Sweden near the Norwegian border. He has spent nearly his entire career in government and in political life. After a period of time as an employee of Hallstahammar's municipality, he became secretary of the Liberal Party in Stockholm and rose quickly in various positions within the Swedish government, as Under-Secretary of State, as Minister of Labor and Energy, and then elected twice to be a member of Parliament in the 1980s, and for a brief period of time was also the Liberal Party leader in the Swedish Parliament. He was appointed to a very distinguished position as governor of Värmland County, essentially his home base and region, in 1990, where he served with distinction and for 12 years, from 1990 to 2002. He was then appointed Marshal of the Realm in September of 2003, serving in that role for 7 years. And in this capacity was directly accountable to His Majesty the King for the activities of the entire royal court organization, including such things as contacts with the government and Swedish Parliament, as well as conducting preparations for state visits and managing all of the royal properties throughout the country. He retired from this position in 2010 and received His Majesty the King's Medal, given to Swedes and to foreign citizens for special merit, and to officials of the court for faithful and long service. He's been here these last 2 days with his wife Karen, first on the campus of Gustavus Adolphus College, speaking to students and faculty, and then here today about Raoul Wallenberg, in large part because of something Steve alluded to, one additional important moment in his professional career and service to Sweden and to the international community. In 2003, he chaired a commission of inquiry into the Raoul Wallenberg matter, a commission which produced an extensive official report entitled A Failure of Diplomacy, demonstrating how catastrophically passive Sweden had acted following Wallenberg's disappearance. We're eager to hear from him, and it's a pleasure to have both him and Karin with us today. So please join me in welcoming Ingemar Eliasson.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, dear friends, thank you for the invitation to meet with you and talk to you. Thank you for hosting this very important meeting in honor of a brave man that made a difference for many people. Because I come here to share with you the story of a man who came to save thousands of people from being killed in the Nazi gas chambers. His name, as you know, was Raoul Wallenberg. He is not a fictional character. His actions were real. What I will tell you about him and his mission at the end of the Second World War can be confirmed by people who are still alive today because of him. I recently met one of them. Her name is Dina Rice. She now lives in Stockholm, Sweden, and she was born in what used to be Yugoslavia. As a child, she escaped death at the hands of the Nazis twice. The first time when German troops occupied her home country of Yugoslavia. The second time when Hungary, the country her family had fled to, was occupied. She and her family were in constant danger, not because they were criminals, just because they were Jews. The first time Dina was saved was thanks to the family's non-Jewish maid, who convinced the Nazi officers that Dina was her daughter. The second time was thanks to the organization Raoul Wallenberg built in order to save Jewish people in Budapest at the end of the war. Was it really needed to set up a special rescue force just to save and protect the Jewish people? Yes, there was. But in spite of that, before the war had ended, 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, were killed in the extermination camps. This fact must never be forgotten or hidden. That fact is the tragic truth we should always remember and keep in mind. It is one of the darkest chapters in the history of mankind. And I'm not referring to prehistoric time. It happened in our time, the time we like to think of as an era of culture and civilization, tolerance, and humanity. In some countries in Europe, known as homelands of classical culture and civilization, brutal and primitive barbarity got the upper hand and reduced people to tools of the devil. It could have happened anywhere, and it can happen again. But adding to this sad story, I also want to remember you that in the deepest darkness, depressed people caught a glimpse of humanity and hope for another and better world. There were, in the terrible story of the persecution of Jews during the Nazi era, also human beings that dared to stand up against the evil. People who made hope survive and brought consolation in the darkness. Such a man was Raoul Wallenberg. And it's through gathering like this that Raoul Wallenberg's life and legacy are remembered. And I want to thank you again for hosting a meeting like this so that we can remember him together. Let me tell you about Raoul Wallenberg by raising 4 questions and try to give you my answers to them. First, what do we know about Wallenberg's achievement? We know that he was sent to the Hungarian capital Budapest in June 1944 in order to help the Jewish people there. At that time, the fortune of war had changed for the worse for the Nazis. It was clear that it was not a question if, but when the so-called Third Reich would be totally defeated. But the war was going to continue for another year and cause the deaths of thousands of people, many of them due to the dreadful side of any war, the Jews just because they were Jews. A central part of Nazi ideology was namely, as we know, the purification of race. Only species of the Aryan race were worth living. To get rid of every Jew in Europe was therefore of special importance. And for that terrible purpose, a special strategy was worked out and an extremely efficient organization out in place. In Germany and in the occupied countries, millions of Jews had at the time already been transported to the extermination camps. Hungary was a German ally, but the Hungarian government had tried to keep a certain distance to the Germans. The Hungarian President Miklos Horthy had opposed the genocide. In spite of that, the Nazis had managed to kill almost 500,000 of the 800,000 Jews living in Hungary. Most of them were transported to the death camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. Now they turned their attention to the 230 Jews living in Budapest. The US and its allies were united with the Soviet Union in the struggle against the Nazis and were eager to advance as far as possible into the European continent before the Nazi troops surrendered. This was done in order to strengthen their position in the upcoming peace negotiations. In the fall of 1944, the Soviet Red Army was therefore rapidly advancing from the east towards Budapest. And of the same reason, Hitler was eager to solve the so-called Jewish question. He had therefore sent the notorious Adolf Eichmann to Budapest to administer the extermination. And that made it extremely urgent to save so many as possible from being killed. The man appointed for that mission was Raoul Wallenberg. Establishing the mission was a decision made by the US State Department. In May 1944, the US government had turned to the neutral nations and asked them to help to protect the Jews in Budapest. Only the Swedish government responded positively. Mr. Wallenberg, a businessman from one of the most prominent Swedish families, was recruited to the Swedish Foreign Ministry in order to help the Swedish diplomatic mission in Budapest. Officially, Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat, but the mission was American. The goal of the mission was formulated by the War Refugee Board the same year created by President Roosevelt. Both the instructions and the financing came from the United States. This mixed responsibility between the US and Sweden had its explanation. The aim was to stress that the task was primarily humanitarian. Mr. Horthy, the Hungarian president, had with the time come to realize that Mr. Hitler's sick dream of universal supremacy was doomed. Therefore, he secretly negotiated with the Allies, including the Soviets, to change sides in the war. On October the 15th, he announced the decision on Hungarian radio. A storm of rejoicing broke out, especially among the Jews. They tore off the yellow star they were forced to wear on their coats. They thought that the nightmare was over, but it wasn't. The Germans were well informed of the political change and had surrounded the capital. President Horthy was forced to resign, and the leader of the Hungarian Nazi Party, the Arrow Cross Party, formed a new government. As a result of this change, the months ahead meant for the Jews a life at the bottom of hell. Before the Soviet Red Army reached Budapest, the situation became totally chaotic. The new Hungarian government lost all control of the militia, which killed and destroyed everything in its way. First and foremost, the Jews and their property. The terror of the Arrow Cross militia knew no restraints. As I mentioned in the outset, Mrs. Dina Rice had told us what the situation these days was like. One day, she and her mother were on their way to her grandfather when they suddenly became witnesses to a pogrom. A group of almost naked people was driven along the street with violent blows in freezing cold weather. The shouts from the guards were mixed with the barking of angry dogs and with cries of despair. Men, women, and children were beaten and kicked. Dina and her mother hid in the darkness in order to avoid detection. Paralyzed with horror, they saw how a group of Jews were executed and thrown into the river Danube. And from a protocol set up by the Swedish Embassy and the International Red Cross, we can read about many similar situations. And I'll quote from one of them, and the protocols with its terrible details. In the morning of Christmas Eve, 2 daycare centers were attacked. On the second floor, 2 old and sick ladies lived. They were immediately killed, as were 2 3-year-old children in hospital room number 8. Outside the room, another 1.5-year-old child was shot. The children's nurse, who wanted to pick up the children, was killed in the corridor. A 13-year-old handicapped boy who was not able to run away was also shot. The bodies are still lying there. No one is allowed to take care of them. End of quotation. Some days later, a gang attacked the Jewish hospital and killed 28 young men. Several so-called Swedish protected houses were also attacked. Altogether, more than 100 people were taken to the shores of the Danube that day and killed. The river was converted into a mass grave. The situation in Budapest in the final days of 1944 deteriorated rapidly for everyone. On the 28th of December, the gas delivery stopped. On the 30th, the electricity was cut. On New Year's Day, the water was cut off. Toilets ceased to function and gave off a sickening smell. The situation was at its worst in the ghettos where most of the Jews were forced to stay. The goal was clear: kill as many Jews as possible before the Russians arrived. Before the October in 1944, Raoul Wallenberg had decided to go back to Sweden because he thought that his mission was accomplished. But now, from midst of October, his rescue mission was more than needed. Instead of closing his business, he had to expand. A special department for food provisioning was established, buying foodstuffs in enormous quantities: meat, vegetables, flour, bread, etc. Most of the food was for the ghetto inhabitants, but some was used to bribe the nurses since there was a general food shortage. During these hectic weeks in the fall of 1944, approximately 100,000 Jews were saved. That is a brief summary of the situation in Budapest in the end of 1944 and of the mission Raoul Wallenberg had to fulfill. And then my second question: why Raoul Wallenberg? Why was just he appointed for the mission? To be honest, it was due to a single coincidence. But as we know today, a lucky coincidence. The US ambassador to Sweden had been asked to find a proper Swede for the mission. The US embassy in Stockholm was at the time located in the same house as the office where Raoul Wallenberg worked. The company's core business was to import foodstuff from Hungary. One day, a US embassy employee met Wallenberg's companion in the elevator, and he asked for a candidate for the mission and got Raoul Wallenberg's name. He came, as I mentioned, from a wealthy family. You can say it's the Swedish equivalent to the Rockefellers. His father died of cancer 3 months before Raoul was born, so his grandfather was the one who made the important decisions about Raoul's education and path in life. Raoul was sent to the US to study architecture at the University of Michigan, and after that received business and banking experience in South Africa and Haifa. And I think it's important to note that Raoul Wallenberg was absent during an important period of time when major decision was made about who in the family would take leading position within business in the future. He never received the position he was meant for, nor the position promised by the elder generations. But as a result of the stay in the US, he spoke English fluently, and like many well-educated people of his generation in Sweden, he spoke German. He had also studied Russian in high school. He was a well-educated, not to say a brilliant young man, and he was motivated to show what he was capable of. On top of it, he was somewhat adventurous. I think it's obvious that he was quite aware of the danger involved in the task he was asked to fulfill. But he didn't hesitate. Without an inner motivation telling you to help other human beings, I don't think anyone would be ready to undertake a mission like his. And Raoul's sister, Mrs. Nina Lagergren, still alive, has told us something that sheds light over his values. In 1944, they saw a movie together about Pimpernel Smith, a British professor who saved persecuted people of Nazi Germany. And witnessing Smith's life and impact, Raoul told Nina, I would like to do something like that. Raoul Wallenberg was obviously the right man for the mission. My next question will be, how did he manage to save and protect so many people? The most important instrument in Wallenberg's rescue operation was the so-called protective passport. The holder of such a passport was made a Swedish citizen and had the right to move to Sweden. Until they were able to do so, the holders of such passport and their dwellings were under the protection of the Royal Swedish Embassy. Before the change in government in October 1944, I just mentioned of, the Hungarian government worked to get the Jewish community out of Hungary. At that time, these passports were therefore authorized rather easily, and thousands were issued. After the change in government, however, the owner's right of protection were less respected, if not at all. This protective passport is often mentioned as the explanation why so many Jews could be saved. And they were of great importance, but without a number of other means and measures, the mission would have failed. As I mentioned, Wallenberg had to build an organization to provide food, water, dwellings, and health care. He had to recruit personnel, approximately 400 people, and he had to educate them and train them for their purpose. He seemed to be an excellent leader and organizer. On top of it, he was a skilled negotiator. He was charming and handsome. He had a good sense of humor, and he was brave. All these qualities came to good use in his contacts with politicians and military personnel in order to get permission and to convince them to act in one direction or another. He bombarded the authorities with claims and requests, and although he had held a rather low rank as a diplomat, he often succeeded in getting in touch with top leaders. He also benefited from Sweden being the so-called protective power for other countries without representation in Budapest, among them the Soviet Union. He used all his authority and sometimes exceeded the powers to reach his goal, saving as many innocent as possible from being killed. And he didn't hesitate even to negotiate with the devil himself. He invited Adolf Eichmann for dinner in order to convince him of the senselessness in continuing the genocide. After the supper, he opened the window's curtains towards the east in order to show Eichmann the fire from the Soviet cannons closing in on Budapest. And on Christmas Eve, at the last minute before the Red Army closed the ring around Budapest, Eichmann went back to Germany. And then my fourth question. What happened to Mr. Wallenberg? What was the fate of this diplomat who saved so many? The main opinion of the time seems to have been that the Soviets had no reason to disapprove what Raoul Wallenberg had achieved in Budapest, as all his conflicts had been with the Nazi leaders, that is to say, the enemies of the Soviet Union. In order to get guarantees for the protection of the Jews under Swedish authority, he therefore tried to contact the Russian military commander, Marshal Malinovsky. After reporting to him about his mission in Budapest, he planned to go back to Stockholm by car. Raoul Wallenberg was taken from one high-ranking Soviet officer to another, interrogated several times, sometimes was met with respect, sometimes with suspiciousness, but he never got to meet the Marshal. On the 16th of January 1945, the Soviet Foreign Office reported to Sweden that Raoul Wallenberg was under the protection of the Soviet army. Since then, the fate of Raoul Wallenberg is veiled in obscurity. To my opinion, and referring to the report given of the commission I chaired, this telegram should have raised every red flag in the Swedish Foreign Office. The lack of activity from the Minister of Foreign Affairs the weeks after Wallenberg's detention remains incomprehensible and throws a dark shadow over the responsible persons in the Swedish Foreign Office at that time. Of course, it's easier many years later to see and say what should have been done. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs and only a few of his colleagues knew that Raoul Wallenberg's mission was an American initiative. They knew that it was a very risky operation and should therefore have given the Swedish diplomat extraordinary protection. Knowing this, the telegram from Moscow should have made them act immediately and set up a special task force to investigate what had happened to him. Already the fact that a Swedish diplomat with diplomatic immunity was apprehended by a foreign military authority should have been enough for immediate action. Also, the Russians were probably aware of Wallenberg's instruction came from the US. That would have been enough to make them suspicious. To take on a job like Wallenberg's, simply to help helpless people, was quite incomprehensible for them. Most likely they thought that his mission was meant to cover his work as a spy of some sort. The petitions and notes that were subsequently sent from the Swedish Foreign Office to Moscow received a variety of answers. For a long time, the official Soviet reaction was that they didn't know of anyone with that name. Different suggestions were proposed. For example, that he must have been killed in a traffic accident on his way to Moscow. But suddenly, 10 years later, in 1957, after a repeated petition from Sweden, the Russians admitted that Raoul Wallenberg had been imprisoned together with many others and had died of a heart attack in the Soviet prison in 1947. And that is still the answer, the official answer. Since the fall of communism in 1991, when Russia was opened up for a close relation with the surrounding world, new possibilities were given to throw light over the case. A special Russian-Swedish commission were therefore set up to go through the Russian archives. Some new facts were presented, but nothing that told us the whole story of what happened to Wallenberg after he was taken by the Soviet army. Some of his belongings were found and were handed over to his relatives, but nothing that changed the official Russian version. The documents that could give us the final answer have not been found and have most likely been destroyed. And the persons who were responsible for what happened are all dead. It may be that after that they had taken Wallenberg, the Soviet leaders realized that he was innocent. In that case, they had two options: either to set him free, confess and apologize, but that would have been humiliating for a superpower like the Soviet Union. The other option was to get rid of him. The heart attack could have been provoked. In addition to the information that Wallenberg had died of a heart attack, it was namely noted that the body had been cremated without post-mortem examination. We may never know what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. What we know is that during some chaotic months in late '44, he saved thousands of Jews from being sent to the Nazis' gas chambers. He managed to a large extent in his mission thanks to some characteristics that were given to him. He was intelligent, he was brave, he was dedicated, and a skilled negotiator. He was charming and handsome. But without a basic love for his fellow human beings, this would not have been enough. Even though I criticized the head of the Swedish foreign ministry of the time, I'm eager to say that it is the leading men in Germany and Soviet Union, Mr. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, that should be blamed. The Nazi leader, because he created the reason why it was necessary to rescue Jews, and Mr. Stalin, because he is responsible for the disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg. So what can we learn from the Raoul Wallenberg story? First of all, we can learn that a man can make a difference. Thanks to Wallenberg, my grandfather got his medicine and survived, Dina Rice told me. Thanks to him, I'm alive and can tell you about what it was like in Budapest at the time. And thanks to him, I could keep my dream alive to be able to once again see a meadow full of flowers, she continued. The difference a human being can make benefits mankind if he or she is guided by the respect of every individual's right to a life in dignity. Secondly, we can learn never to accept that any human being to be humiliated or persecuted because of religion, color, ethnic background, or age, neither in war nor in peace, not at school or in the workplace, not in the army or in hospitals, not in churches or in the streets, neither in America nor in Sweden, nowhere, never. And when it happens, because it will happen again, you and I can make a difference by standing up as spokesmen for humanity and dignity. That is what the example of Raoul Wallenberg tells us. To honor his work and the values he stood for, you can see Wallenberg's monuments in more than 60 places all over the world. You see his name on streets and squares. You hear of prizes and awards given in his name. Because of his achievements, he was made an honorary citizen of the United States in 1981. As a Swede, I'm very proud of knowing that a countryman of mine has been honored in this way. But most of all, it faces me with the duty to remind myself of everyone's responsibility to stand up, to protect human dignity. And that is the main lesson from the heroic and sad story of Raoul Wallenberg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingemar, for that inspiring summary and those challenging words. Mr. Eliasson will take some questions now. We have a brief bit of time before we want to start the reception. And I'm going to try to help if there's some dissonance in the acoustics here to try to interpret those questions. So is there a question? Yes.
Can we pass the microphone down?
You can come up here, Ingemar.
How did he create the papers that then were used by the Jews to proclaim themselves to be Swedish citizens?
How do we create a paper?
The Schutzpass.
For Schutzpass?
Yeah.
Who? I have no details. I don't think I can answer that question. Maybe someone else here is better to answer that. Sorry.
Yes,
You
Charles.
can.
You can. Yes, you may. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I am Charles Fodor, and I am from Budapest, and I am a Holocaust survivor. Not only the Swedish, but the Portuguese ambassador and the Spanish and the Swiss ambassador in the embassies had documents which they put together, and then people could apply for these documents. So the Schutzpasse, which they were able to, I had one of those, and my relatives had one of those too. That's how the papers were in the embassies.
Thank you, Charles. Another question? Way in the back. Oops.
No. When you were head of the commission, did you find there was any truth to stories that Gulag inmates had seen Mr. Wallenberg after 1947?
Well, not in my commission, but the commission that the Swedish-Russian commission that worked before us. They went through a lot of rumors and witnesses from people that had been in cells besides Raoul Wallenberg. And all these witnesses or rumors were examined, but nothing new came out of what really happened to him.
You had said that the United States, the War Refugee Board, was behind Raoul Wallenberg in the country of Sweden, and I was just wondering, did the United States, were they behind the scenes in helping to find out information about what happened to Raoul, or did they just not get involved, or how involved were they in supporting Sweden in their efforts to find out what happened to Raoul?
Well, I think they did, but I think also that the foreign ministry in Sweden could have asked for help from the State Department in the U.S. And why they didn't may be of the reason that, Sweden was neutral country, and they thought that it was easier to get an honest answer if it was not part of the conflict between the Allies and the Soviet Union. But they could have, to my opinion, they could have supported if we have asked for it.
Thank you for being here. What do you think it's going to take today to create people in the spirit of Raoul Wallenberg going forward?
That's an important question, and I don't think I have a better answer than anyone else. But to hear about other people that dare to stand up against the devil is one way to be stimulated and be brave enough. But I don't think that anyone really knew how we would react if we were in such a situation. I hope that if we got, so to speak, the right values from the beginning, maybe it's more likely that we will do the right things when we will be in that position. But at least it's more likely that we act in the benefits of mankind if we have got to learn that it's a natural thing to assist people in need. So how we raise our children, what kind of values we hand over to them, it's at least a good ground for that Raoul Wallenberg should have many in his footprint in the future.
Thank you again, Ingemar. We'll take a break now. So we have about an hour or so for conversation and dialogue. Some refreshments will be passed, and we will reconvene here at shortly before 4 o'clock for the second part of our program. Thank you for coming. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining us again for the second part of this afternoon's program, focusing upon the life, legacy, and contributions of Raoul Wallenberg. We're really privileged to have with us this afternoon Janet Horvath and her accompanist Heather McLaughlin to present a gift of music on this occasion. As you know, Janet Horvath wears many hats. She has retired recently after 32 years as the associate principal cellist for the Minnesota Orchestra, and is a writer, an anti-racism spokesperson, and a pioneer in performing arts medicine. We are really indeed grateful that she is here together with Heather this afternoon, and she's going to say a few words about the musical selections that she has picked for this afternoon's performance. So would you please welcome Janet Horvath, Heather McLaughlin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Steve Honiggs, JCRC Executive Director, and Ingemar Eliasson for your wonderful remarks. Very, very touching and informative. I'd also like to thank Chelsea Bowen, who helped me tremendously getting all this stuff organized. Distinguished guests, it is my honor and privilege to play today in remembrance of Raoul Wallenberg, who saved, as you heard, 100,000 Hungarian Jews, including my own mother. I would not be standing in front of you probably today had my mother not survived the siege of Budapest, and I have no idea how she was able to survive the bombing, the constant bombing of Budapest, and she was in hiding, and she was 17 years old. So I owe a great debt of gratitude to him and his example to mankind. And if anyone can say it any more eloquently than Mr. Eliasson did, one person can make a difference and can stand up for hatred and racism that is still going on today. I chose the following few selections that I hope you'll enjoy. The first one is called Ritzai. It is one of my favorite chants that's sung in the synagogue. And the meaning of the words is, I pray that my doubting spirit may learn to entertain, to hope, to be free to feel, free to love, and free to give thanks for life. Graciously receive our prayers. The next two pieces are in honor of the Swedish people among us. It's two Swedish very short compositions which we'll play right after each other. One is by Mits Lindström, who is a colleague of mine about my age and a wonderful cellist who composed this piece called Lamento. And the second piece, just an excerpt, is by Jakob Adolf Haag, who was born in 1850 and actually wrote 4 symphonies and chamber music and a lot of piano compositions, and we don't really know too much about him, and his works deserve to be performed. And finally, I have to go back to Hungary, of course, and I'm playing a virtuoso piece by David Popper, who was actually born in the Prague ghetto and had to go through the ghetto and get a pass in order to get cello lessons. He eventually made his way to the Budapest Academy, where he was an esteemed teacher there for many, many years, a prolific composer, and he's almost a direct relative to me because his student was my teacher, János Starker's student. So we are in a direct line there. So I hope you enjoy these works today.
Good afternoon again. Wonderful Heather, wonderful Janet. Thank you so very much. Gorgeous music. Now we'll proceed to have a little panel discussion so we can hear from some of our precious survivors of the Holocaust here in our community, all of whom have a strong connection to Hungary and Sweden. Let me make some brief introductions. If you look on the back side of your program, you'll see that these wonderful little vignettes of the stories of the survivors. The author of these vignettes, Lily Chester, is here with us today. So thank you, Lily. It's part of our JCRC's Holocaust Survivors Portrait Project, and the photographer, David Sherman, has these beautiful photographs of a number of survivors from our community. Here with us today, and if I can make one comment, is if one of the goals of the Nazis was to destroy and or suppress the human spirit, you can see by the lives of these gentlemen that exactly the opposite occurred. We have Dr. Fish, who's a physician and a wonderful artist and poet. We have, pardon me for 1 second, Fred Barron, man who started his own business, among other things. And just yesterday, just Friday, a couple days ago, I heard him speak at South St. Paul High School to 2 classes of high school students there. Charles Fodor, who devoted much of his professional life to the American Red Cross, to helping other people in distress, who I'm proud to say is a JCRC board member, among its other things in life. And then we have a wonderful dear friend, Dan Wilderson, who's a professor at St. Cloud State and is the director of SCSU's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education. So, gentlemen, if the 3 of you and Daniel will come up and have a little discussion. Thank you very much. Bruce, do we want to move this? No, it's okay. Okay. You don't need to lose you at this stage, okay?
Here we go. So you'll.
It's on.
So you want to test them.
So they're not blocked by
Just a couple words to begin. Maybe to contextualize a little bit of our conversation. I've been the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education at St. Cloud State since 2009. I am currently teaching one class, the Holocaust literature course. It's an English course. And we're reading mostly memoirs. And I'm making my way through the first round of essays of my students. And a few years ago, I was at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for what was called the Silberman Seminar, which was looking particularly at the victims' experience of the Holocaust, with the argument that much of what we've learned about the Holocaust has been given to us from the perpetrator's perspective. And Deborah Lipstadt and Susie Suleiman were interested in facilitating a discussion about how it's important to take the perspective from how a victim might view it. my students in their papers probably predominantly are saying that they had learned something about the history of the Holocaust, but it did not take on the meaning and depth and the emotional impact until they started reading the stories of survivors. And I think that's one of the things that we're here to honor and celebrate. And I know that there are a number of survivors who are in the audience, and could we just take a moment, if they would like to stand, to honor them? Thank you so much for being here. The Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education attempts to teach three things: intellectual rigor, emotional engagement, and ethical reflection. And if we balance these, I think we'll be getting at some of the answers perhaps that were called for in the questions that we were entertaining today. So to our panelists, thank you for being here, and thank you for allowing me to be your moderator. I'm very honored to be on the same stage as you. What I would like to do is begin by getting maybe an opening statement from each of you, concise, about the intersection of your lives and Hungary and or Raoul Wallenberg and Sweden. Dr. Fish?
Well, first of all, I would like to say this to you before anything else. The most important thing is not what's happening with us. The most important what we can learn from it. And I think this is what I would like to share with you. The most important, how we can teach children humanity. And I think this is what we should talk about the Holocaust. What happened with me is absolutely irrelevant, because the real witnesses we may be a witness, but we were not victim. And I think the real story will never be told. So again, humanity is the most important. And I don't want to tell what happened with me or with my family, because most of them were killed. But I would like just to say to you that the most important is to remain human, even in inhumane circumstances. And in order to do this, two things is important. We have to teach our children by the parents how to be a human being, because that's not an inherited thing. The second is that the most dangerous people is not the perpetrators. The most dangerous people is the indifferent. It's not my business. And these are the majority. And when that's happening, then of course everything can happen. Don't say it doesn't matter. It's not your business. Just stand up if something happening with anybody. Because if something can happen with the so-called rich people or the union people, then also can happen with you. And I think that's what we have to learn from the Holocaust.
Thank you.
My name is Fred Baron. I was born in Vienna, Austria. And I have been speaking on the subject of Holocaust for many years in schools and civic organizations and colleges. And it is a terrible experience for me to see that today, so many years after the end of the war, and when we were able to survive these atrocities of the Second World War, there is still so much violence in this world. There is killing of innocents going on all over the world. And we seem to have learned so little from our previous experience. And then I am reminded that learning is a very slow and tedious process. And it is a very, very long experience to take the lessons of our fathers and grandfathers and build a better future. So despite all the violence and the crime that is going on today, I remain an optimist. And I believe strongly that our new generations, that you, will be able to build a world where we not only learn from our past experiences, but where we can avoid the worst experiences from it.
I'm Charles Fodor, and I also sometimes speak to schools. And one of the schools I spoke to, there were a lot of young children. And I said to the children, try to get the stories from your grandparents, because if you don't, it will be lost. Because Cambodia and Vietnam had a Holocaust and a killing field of their own. And I think their memories needs to be saved also. It doesn't stop. For somehow we humans don't learn from the past, and it keeps having genocide in other parts of the world, whether it's in Bosnia or Africa or the Cambodian killing fields.
One of the things that all of you have sort of implied or spoken is that there is this quality in human beings, a capacity for evil, and then there's also a capacity for good. And the dangerous person is the perpetrator, but also the person who does nothing. I wonder if you could describe the characteristics or values or profile of a person who you would identify as an upstander or a rescuer, or as a person who would stand in a place with you.
Well, I think that, first of all, I think that when we say we are humans, that's a very bad expression. We are not humans. We are animals. And we have to learn humanity. And if your mother or father was the best person, you didn't inherit that. You have to learn it. And I think that's the number one thing. We say that children are very good. Children are not good. They're innocent. And they have to be taught. And I think this is the whole point. If it's think what's happening today is better than last year, this is not whatsoever. 50 million people were killed after the Second World War. 50 million people. So we're not any better than we were before. And I don't think our children should be any better. We have to learn from it. And I think that's our responsibility. And I think this place, and this specific place here, is a very important thing to me. About 20 years ago, I was talking in Gustav Adolphus University, and people even then did not know, many of them, who is Raoul Wallenberg. And I think Raoul Wallenberg would be a wonderful person to be using as a sample of humanity, but his sacrifice and what he did during the Second World War, and the Swedish Institute and the Jewish community together could establish maybe a foundation that this memory should be maintained. And we have to have a good example for the student to learn from it. I think it's who is bad and who is good, we cannot define it here. What is good for me is bad for someone else. What we call friends is enemy for others. So I think we have to show some example, and that's the only way we can do something. And I think this would be an incredible opportunity to both of you to get together and have something here for the future.
Thank you.
I happen to disagree with my friend here on some items. And I'll tell you why. As I indicated before, firmly believe that we do learn from our mistakes. and that we do try to improve ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. And as to the quality within each one of us, I firmly believe that we have both good and bad qualities within each and every one of us. And it is up to us to make a choice, to decide what we want to become. And our job, our responsibility, and I mean the Holocaust survivors' responsibility to some degree, is to make that choice easier and to explain some of the things that happened in the past. It is easy to blame sometimes certain aspects of humanity, certain people of this and that race, but we have an obligation and a duty to ourselves and to our children to explain to them that there are good and bad ones among all of us, that we should not judge people by the way they look, by the color of their skin, or by the way they are clad, but solely by what is in here and in here. Thank you.
I am going to go to my past. When my grandmother and I were on the way to one of these protected houses in Budapest, we were stopped by some Hungarian fascists and ordered into a building. We didn't know at the time, but we later learned that those people who were in that building were shot into the Danube later that day. As we were walking into the building, a man came toward us from the building, apartment house, and said, "Come with me, you don't belong here." Took us away from the fascists, took us around the corner and said, "Get lost." Every one of us could be a hero under the right circumstances and the right time to save a human life. Because of this person, I am alive and here today.
One of the things that we were considering was opening up the floor to some questions that you might have for these men. Does anyone have a question? What's it? Okay.
If we today, gentlemen, see a call for a destruction by one people against another people, what do you suggest us as the younger generation? What are we supposed to do?
Repeat the question.
Yeah. So if we hear a general call for the destruction of a people, what should we do?
So
What should be what would you recommend as a course of action if?
Well, I think that Mark Twain had a wonderful story about this. That a person who, to certain people you can make improvement, to others you cannot do any question. And so I think that's very hard to answer what to do with a person. I think the person who commits crime should be punished, not number one. But I would tell you a much more interesting story, which is much more understood. Any of you who were visiting Mauthausen concentration camp, we can learn that in February 12, 1945, in the Mauthausen concentration camp, and I cannot describe the detail to you, but it was the Russians were actually the majority. Russian prisoners were a majority, and 2,000 Russians rebelled, killed the German guard, and tried to escape. They are all malnourished individuals, and within a matter of minutes, they were most of them machine gunned down. And in the village, the people knew that something happening there, not exactly what happening, but they know it's something bad happening there, even if they wouldn't be any smart. And then, to make the story short, 8 Russians, among other, let's say you are the owner of the home, you have your family around you, you either old or sick, or otherwise average age person is in the military, and suddenly someone knock your door and is a lice-infested, malnourished Russian is asking you, help me. Well, by the way, the person who gave us, for example, on the way, apple was shot and killed. So I would like to raise a question, would you save your enemy? Because your brother, your husband, or your son is fighting against the Russians. And here is a lice-infested who asking you to help me in. If you would go to help them in, you have to give them food, you have to undress them, you have to burn their clothes, you have to give them a shower and hide them. And then the SS soldiers within 15 minutes is coming and searching with dogs. And if they find the Russians, everybody shot and threw their body out. What would you do? 8 Russians were saved. Everywhere in the world, German, Israeli, and American Russians has bad people and good people. And to be human being, you have to stand up and save the life. I have to say to you honestly, I could not save anyone who would, because of that, my child would be killed, and most of us would not, but there were people who did it. And that's what the problem is. It's not about people, bad people, good people, Russian people, Jewish people, atheist or Catholic or Jewish. We are a bear-shaped curve. We have to belong to one place and don't be indifferent. That's again the point.
Right. Anybody else want to answer that?
Well, it may not have anything directly to do with your question, but I would like to say this, that according to Jewish beliefs and according to what I personally feel, of course. Can you hear me? Yes. All right. I'm sorry. We cannot hold any new generation responsible for the deeds of the previous ones, of their parents or grandparents. Each individual is responsible for his or her own deeds. And this is something that we have to keep in mind today when most of the perpetrators, as well as most of the survivors of this area, are long gone. But I would like to tell you one thing on my personal experience that I feel, and it is my conviction, that I'm here today because of what happened in Hungary, what happened in a Hungarian court when a judge in 1941 decided not to send me back to Vienna, where I came from, despite the instructions he had when I was caught in a Hungarian city close to the border. And in the same token, I'm here today because of what happened in a German hospital when a Swedish group of physicians and Red Cross workers came to select some people from the hospital to be sent to Sweden to recuperate. I was laying in a bed. I was taken care of by German nurses and physicians, and this group of people, Red Cross workers, looked at my remarks printed on the foot of the bed, my birthplace, and took one look and passed me over. Did not talk to me and did not take my name down. I didn't know what that all meant, but after a couple hours, a nurse came and I asked her what was this group of people doing here. She said, they selected people to go to Sweden. I said, they did not stop at my bed. She said, no, because you were born in Austria. You're an Austrian, and Germans and Austrians were not to be taken to Sweden. So I said to her, this is not fair. I'm here because I'm a Jew, not because I'm an Austrian. Why don't you tell them to that? Tell them to these people. And the nurse said, I'll see what I can do. And lo and behold, 2 days later, I was taken.
I don't know what the question was at this
point. We've drifted from the question, but if you want to know, the question was, what would be what course of action would you recommend if there was a call for the extermination of a group of people by another group of people?
You speak up.
Where?
The political arena. Election is coming up, folks.
I would like to ask you, Mr. Fedor, I would like to know what happened to you after you escaped that house, and specifically, how did people protect you? Maybe if I know about how you were protected, it might give me some clues about what an ordinary citizen like myself can do if such a circumstance arose here.
I am not sure that I totally got the question, so.
Yes, let me.
Okay. Okay. My mother was taken away on November 11th, and she didn't return. And I was with my grandmother and grandparents, and we were taken to the protected house by the Danube River. So after we left that Hungarian fascist building, we went to the protected house, and we were there for approximately a month when all of a sudden, as you have mentioned earlier, the Hungarian fascists no longer honored the past what we had from the different neutral countries' governments, and we were all escorted with bayoneted soldiers into the Budapest ghetto. And this was in the middle of December, and the war ended on the 18th of January for me. The Russians liberated us. It was wonderful they came. We only had one problem. They stayed too long.
Gentlemen, if you would like to, Fred and Dr. Fish, if you would like to answer that question too, which is really asking for information about how the common person helped.
Well, I think that my family, my father was killed by the Hungarians actually, and my rest of my family were all eliminated. My mother was hidden by the person who raised me, who was a Catholic person. She was my nanny, and she lived with us. And so that was my personal experience. But I think that what happened later is I met with these liberating Russians, and they robbed me. They raped my mother, who was hiding, that lovely liberated Russians. And I think the Russians were about as shitty as the Nazis were, because they killed much more people, and we're still chasing the 90-year-old Nazis, and we talk about Putin is a wonderful person. After the election, I will be much closer to him, and this kind of thing, and I think this is again a discrimination of the highest level. And I think that what I would say again, I was participating in the revolution because it was under the beautiful communist Russia, because I could not be a suppressor, because I was offered, by the way, to be communist. I could have a wonderful life, but I couldn't because I was suppressed before. We all have an individual decision to make, and I think we are the only change in this world can be done by you, and maybe through you, a few other. Don't believe that the presidents or anyone is going to change the world. You are the only one who can make it. The rest is a dream. And I think we have to stand individually up for humanity, or we don't. That's all it is.
Fred Barron, would you like to answer that?
I would like to talk, if I may, on a slightly different subject matter, on the need to judge people not by their nationality, not by their uniforms, but by their personalities. And I remember from my youth that I was 15 years old when Austria became part of Germany and part of the Hitler organization, that there were many times when it was too dangerous for me or my family to stay in our apartment because of the impending deportations to somewhere in the East. And I remember distinctly being hidden here or there by non-Jewish neighbors that sometimes risked, often, all the time when they did this, risked their own safety and possibly their own lives as well. So I feel that we cannot escape from the terrible things that happened, but we should also keep in mind that there were always exceptions to their rule.
We have time for a couple more.
I'm a Holocaust survivor in hiding. I would like to give an answer to the person who asked what should be done if the danger of a genocide or Holocaust is coming. What's happening here today is what a fight against any kind of genocide or discrimination. This kind of get together during the Holocaust, there happened a lot and very many bad things. And always having in mind what the other gentleman said before that we cannot accuse the current generations for what the older have done. As Elie Wiesel said, children of murderers are not murderers. Having this in mind, I want to tell you that Holocaust was not only bad, was not only terrible, was not only brutal, was not only horrible. As Elie Wiesel said, who is a direct survivor from concentration camps, Holocaust was bestiality. Bestiality of the worst kind. That's why we have to remind ourselves every year in some get-together of all these bad things that they happen. And I want to tell you what we used to say after the liberation. Never again. This should stay with all of us, Jews, Christians, or any other. And deep in our conscience, ready always to stand up against any other Holocaust or genocide. Thank you.
Thank you. There was one other hand back here.
Well, it's very difficult to even say words after that profound statement. I almost don't want to even say anything, but I'm curious of everyone here. It might be instructive to find out how you would suggest or give advice to someone to try to heal from these horrible things. As you all know, Viktor Frankl wrote so powerfully in his logotherapy about healing. And my father was an American aviator, shot down over Germany, and he had post-traumatic stress disorder before there was a word, but he didn't suffer anything like the people who did in the Holocaust. So I'm just wondering what your advice would be to someone among people that the doctor mentioned, people who have suffered these things. What are the processes of healing?
It's a very simple answer for your question, but it's not so simple if you have a complicated. The answer is, it's a beautiful story. They ask, what is the three most important to give your child? They ask a rabbi. And the answer was example, example, example. The problem what we have is not we don't have good system in the schools. The problem we have many children who grew up without father, without family, and it's getting the numbers are increasing, and they are the youngest criminals in the country, 80% of them, because who grew up in such a family. If we don't have a strength of a family as such, then we cannot have a life and we don't have surprises. That's exactly the example. It was no other answer. The other is all baloney. We cannot make people to be better or whatnot. You have to show example. And I think this is what we have to face.
The most important thing for me that I'm hearing today is we are relating these experiences that happened over 50 years ago to today's world and making it important for all people, just as it is important for the Jewish people. There were people even in the camps who were not Jewish who were there because they were working against Hitler. And that's what we need, is more of that. So that's basically what I wanted to say.
Do we have another question? Maybe one more? You?
Not a question, but to begin to answer the question that was raised by the gentleman who spoke after Mr. Vital about how these particular people survived and what are the lessons to be learned about someone who experiences such a horrifically traumatic event, and how did they come to begin to heal. I think, speaking from my husband at least, he may not have heard the question, and I know intimately his particular story of healing, and I wonder if you would share a little bit more about that.
I presume that was a cue. I think the best way to heal is to tell the story. Not only to tell the story, but just like I earlier mentioned that about the monk children, that we weren't the only one. And genocide is continuing, and it should be shared with everyone what their grandparents and parents went through, what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Bosnia. If we keep talking about it, even if it's painful to us to relive it over and over again, as we share the story, we heal a little bit of ourselves.
Well, nothing much can be added to this, I feel. But
Don't put it in his mouth.
maybe it's just as well that not everybody can hear me. You know, I'm sitting here and looking at the audience and thinking that we are here to, in memory of Raoul Wallenberg, one individual who did make a change all by himself and then had to pay a terrible price for it. And as we learn, very little, if anything, has been done to find out really why he died, or how he died, or even when he died. So it seems to me that we have today many more ways of researching the truth, of delving into our past and our present if needed be. We have electronics and other means available that were not existent when we went through this stage. And to me, I told you I'm an optimist. This is, again, a way of bettering our communications, bettering our understanding of each other, and hopefully a better way of life for all of us.
I think we have to go back to Raoul Wallenberg, indeed, as you said. And I think this is what I would like to ask these two gentlemen who has the possibility to make this not just a yearly episode for us, but also to try to make an effort, which is, by the way, so far failed, that this Wallenberg story should be learned in schools, not about what happened, that was people, again, stood up and sacrificed not only his own life, but he was able to save so many other people. That would be the best way to do it if the kids in the school, as under the name of humanity or I don't know whatever, would have an opportunity to learn this story, because this was a most remarkable person. during the Second World War who did something which was extraordinary. Many people saved lives. Many people sacrificed themselves even. But his was exceptionally, and his memory should be kept this way alive. Not again, because what we learned from the past, we don't learn anything from the past. And our presidents, and talking about even President Roosevelt, he didn't know the history. He didn't even know the Japanese attacked the Russians 50 years before that. We was not prepared. So we cannot talk about politicians, we should talk about children. We should talk about two children who had to learn something in the school about humanity. Unfortunately, many children here, for different reasons, cannot be praised and cannot be punished, because that we have to equally treat everybody, and this is not lead to anything further than further chaos. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful life.
Charles Fodor, Fred Barron, Dr. Robert Fish, thank you for sharing your lives with us.
Thank you.